Almost alone among the Spanish possessions, Cuba had remained loyal. It was the ever-faithful isle, proof that God's blessing continued to shine on Spain's imperial status. In return, old Spain had given the young Cuba wealth, learning, and the arts. With the rebels at the gates of Havana, Spanish Capitan General Martinez Campos was acutely aware of the value of Cuba to Spain, but he also realized that total war was the only way of saving it. This he could not face. Reluctantly, he resigned, and in his place, Queen Maria Cristina appointed a ruthless general, Valeriano Weyler.
He has the face of a reptile, the body of a dwarf, a jackal's instinct, and the soul of a dog.
So ran a Cuban song of the time. Weyler decided that the only answer was to force the rural population into the towns so that they couldn't help the rebels. This policy of reconcentration left the people without housing, food, and medical care, and led to the death of more than 300,000 civilians. Weyler's war has not been forgotten. This Cuban film, made in the 1960s, portrays it as a nightmare. Weyler's troops broke into homes, carted off civilians, and abused women and children. It was a military success, at least in the short term. Rebel leader General Maceo was killed, and the Cuban offensive halted. Jose Marti, who had recently landed on the island, had been ordered to stay out of trouble. But when his expeditionary force was ambushed by Spanish troops, he mounted his white horse and threw himself into the middle of a vicious skirmish. He was shot dead, leading a fruitless charge on his very first engagement in battle. So died the idealist who sacrificed a lifetime's cause for a moment of glory. But the rebels were far from crushed. The war was at a standstill. 200,000 Spanish troops were required to garrison the towns and fortresses, while the rebels still controlled much of the countryside. Most of all, reconcentration was a public relations disaster. Its horrors were about to bring American opinion to boiling point. In America, General Weyler's tactics were a gift to the press, particularly to the owner of the New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst. One of his editions labeled Weyler the brute, the destroyer of families and the outrager of women, pitiless, cold, and exterminator of men. American opinion began to smolder against the Spanish. Then came the firecracker, an event that has become a legend. On the night of February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine was moored in Havana harbor. Most of the 327 sailors and Marines lay peacefully in their hammocks, blissfully unaware of the events that were about to unfold. An explosion tore open the hull, and a wall of fire burst through the berth deck, hurling bodies and wreckage into the cold night air. "268 American soldiers lost their lives. They were given a martyr's funeral, first in Havana and then in Key West, the nearest point to Cuba, only 90 miles away. The Journal was ablaze with fiery headlines. It had no doubt who was guilty. That week, the paper's circulation soared to over 1 million. Hearst told his readers what they wanted to hear, but at the same time, he shared the public mood.
There's no one reason why Hearst wanted the Americans to go to war in Cuba. There are many reasons. One, like many other Americans, he wanted the Spaniards out. Two, he believed that Cubans were being mistreated and like the Americans, deserved their liberation from a European power. 3, he saw the war as a way to sell newspapers.
Immediately after the disaster, both the United States and Spain appointed commissions of inquiry. They came to opposite conclusions. It was no surprise when the American report laid the blame most probably on a Spanish mine. The Spanish investigation suggested internal combustion caused by heat in the engine room. America's mood was vengeful, with pity for the Cuban victims of reconcentration in the backs of people's mind. However, there was also another agenda.
We thought, I think, as a nation, at the public level, that we were going in to end a brutal war between the Cubans and the Spanish. At the elite level, at the presidential Secretary of State level, there was a real fear that what was happening in Cuba was that Spain was going to disappear and a Cuban revolutionary government was going to win that war and take over the islands and threaten American property and make it impossible for the United States to get a naval base in Cuba. So at the elite level, we went into Cuba for very hard-headed American self-interest. At the public level, we thought we were going in for humanitarian reasons.
The Spanish Capitan General's palace is now the office of Havana's official historian, Professor Leal. He has no doubt that Cuba was winning the war on its own and that America joined in for its own interests.
La motiva el hecho de que ellos quieren precipitar los acontecimientos y precipitarlos a su favor.
Their motives were self-interest. The American intervention was more to do with a long-term plan to take possession of Cuba. At that time, many American politicians talked about how ripe fruit would fall from the trees following the laws of gravity, and they would only have to hold out their hands and take it.
But President McKinley, conferring with his cabinet, was cautious. He hated war. He would have liked to have got his way by negotiation, but the longer the bitter struggle for Cuba lasted, the greater was the cost to America's economic interests. American investments in the sugar and mining industries of Cuba were worth $50 million alone, with annual trade accounting for a further $100 million.
McKinley had been a war hero in the American Civil War 30 years before, and he did not enter war lightly. He once said to an aide that, he said, "I hate war. I have seen the bodies piled up in the battlefields, and I do not want to see them piled up again." And we know that as he approached war, he was taking sleeping pills because he could not sleep at night. But he did, on the other hand, want the things that only war could provide. He wanted a Cuba that would give the United States what it wanted. And he wanted a base in the far Pacific, particularly in the Philippines, that would give the United States entry into Asia. And the only way he could get these two things, the only way he could get the naval base that he wanted in Cuba and the naval base he wanted in the Western Pacific, was to go to war against Spain. So in the end, he went to war.
On April 11th, crowds gathered outside Congress while McKinley made an impassioned speech for American intervention to stop the war between Spain and Cuba.
In the name of humanity, in the name of civilization, on behalf of endangered American interests, which give us the right to speak and to act, the war in Cuba must stop.
Congress consented with enthusiasm, but Cuban exiles, fearing that America might take over the island, pressed for a compromise. The Teller Amendment, as it became known, declared that the U.S. had no intention of keeping Cuba after it had been freed from Spain. This was to haunt America in years to come. In her royal palace in Madrid, Queen Regent Maria Cristina, mother of the future King Alfonso XIII, felt she had no alternative but war. Already her government had made compromises. It had removed the hated Weyler from command, given compensation to victims of the Maine, even offered the Cubans self-government, but complete independence was out of the question. On April 24th, with a heavy heart, Maria Cristina addressed the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes. She announced that Spain was breaking off diplomatic relations with America, a virtual declaration of war.
With an army and navy with glorious traditions, and with a nation united facing foreign aggression, we shall survive today without loss to our honor, the crises that have been forced upon us unreasonably.
Anti-American feeling ran high in Spain. Consulates were attacked. Americans were portrayed as pigs. But despite the rhetoric, the Spanish government feared a confrontation with the might of the American Navy. At the same time, it feared a confrontation with its own citizens if it did not fight. In truth, the government was pushed into war against its wishes.
The Spanish government was between the horns of a nasty dilemmas, either to confront the American Army and Navy or else its own army in a military coup or a popular revolution.
Then, on May 1st, came the Battle of Manila Bay. It left Americans with no doubt about their new naval power. But a small doubt did still linger over the incident that had precipitated the battle, the sinking of the Maine. Who had been responsible? The question is still being asked. In 1911, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers raised the wreck of the Maine from the seabed. They concluded again that the explosion was external. But in 1975, another inquiry led by American Admiral Hyman Rickover concluded, in all probability, the Maine was destroyed by an accident that occurred inside the ship. Today, Cubans put a third theory forward. They blame not an American accident, but American treachery. This statue in Havana Harbor says, "To the sailors of the Maine, victims of American imperialism." Now there is further new evidence that carries the ring of truth. It comes from the descendant of the Spanish harbor master in Havana in 1898.
Recayó sobre él la terrible obligación de bajar a inspeccionar.
He had the terrible job of going down to inspect the hull of the sunken ship, accompanied by divers, to determine the cause of the explosion and what led to the sinking of the ship.
Cómo se había producido, que había llevado al hundimiento del navío. En relatos familiares,
in our family history, it has always been said that he knew right from the start that the explosion had been from the inside out.
Había sido de dentro a fuera. Sufrió todo tipo de presiones.
He was put under all sorts of pressure from the American Commission of politicians, senators, and officials from the Navy, who even went as far as going to his house. He felt obliged, against his will and contrary to the facts, to write a report that didn't conform to what he had seen. He never really got over the affair. He died shortly afterwards. The family has always said that he died because he was so upset by the incident.
100 years ago, what appears to have been a tragic accident was exploited by an American newspaper baron, and it brought two countries to war. It was time for a battle hymn, and thanks to a new American invention, one had recently been recorded. It has become the Cuban national anthem. The Spanish-American War on land was about to begin.